Today, our speakers come from a very diverse range of backgrounds, both professionally and geographically. So we have to say thank you for them taking their time out to participate and to contribute to these very relevant conversations. Our first panel discussion on this day 2 of CANTO's 36th Annual Conference and Virtual Exhibition looks at regulating the digital economy. Certainly something that is on the front burner given our current landscape. To facilitate the discussion in this panel is Philippe Dufresne. Philippe is the founding director of Cullen International, a company monitoring regulatory development in telecommunications, digital economy, media, postal, and competition law. He's an economist by training and has spent the last 30 years analyzing telecommunications regulation and market developments. He's a regular fixture on the conference landscape, speaking and chairing events from as far as Europe, Latin America, and MENA, so we know we are indeed in capable hands. Philippe, I leave you to do the introduction of your panelists. Welcome to CANTO 2021, the 36th Annual Conference and Virtual Exhibition. Philippe?
Thank you, Wendell. It's great to see you, although I very much hope that next year we'll be able to meet face-to-face, but it's great to see you at a distance through the miracle of telecommunication technologies. Welcome, everybody, to this session with a very ambitious title, Successful Strategies for the Regulation of Big Tech in the Caribbean. And if we had more time, I would start by reminding the audience of the benefits brought by big tech, but you're all starting with the opportunity of holding this conference in COVID times. But next to the great benefits brought by big tech, we would like in this session to look at basically two areas of concern related to the functioning of online platforms in today's world. The first aspect is a number of antitrust cases throughout the world, in all regions of the world really, have demonstrated that in a number of instances, big tech companies are abusing their dominant position. There is nothing wrong with being big. It has some benefits, but what is prohibited under laws around the world is to abuse those dominant positions, because in the end, it leads to stifling innovation, and it leads to a reduction of welfare for society and for citizens. The other big area of growing concern is that although platforms, again, some of the platforms are doing great efforts to remove illegal and harmful content, absolutely more needs to be done in this field by platforms, but as we will see also for legislators in terms of clarifying the rules. So without further ado, we have 4 distinguished panelists with different background and specialties. I will introduce them as I invite them to come along to offer their introductory remarks. The first panelist is Professor Alexandre de Strail, who is a professor at the University of Namur in Belgium, and also a fellow at the Namur Digital Institute. I would like now to introduce Alexandre. Thank you very much. You are muted, Alex. Yeah. Thank you. Welcome, yes. Alexandre. And over to you. I think that Alex will focus on the first topic that I mentioned. This string of competition cases and what's next after that. Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you very much, everyone, for the invitation. Sorry, I lost a bit my voice yesterday, but I will try to do my best. And so indeed, what I want to discuss with you is the economic aspect and the antitrust and competition aspect of big tech. So let me share my screen. Hopefully it will work. And if it doesn't, let me know. Okay, and those are my slides. So do you see them? Do you see the slides or no?
Okay, it's coming. Perfect. well, at least, and if you expand them, we'll be in good shape.
Okay. Is it okay like that?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
And your slides are beautiful. I can't see them, but well, perfect. Here they are. Great.
Okay.
Great.
So thank you very much.
Pandemic, Alex, and we'll be.
So yes, so you may remember this famous sentence by Zuckerberg, the founders of Facebook, that those companies have to move fast and break things. And indeed, this is what they have done over the last 20 years, and they have breaks many business to some extent, but also they have brought a lot of innovation. And also this conference could not happen without those kind of companies. But okay, they had a good 20 years, and still, if you see the result that they have published, still last year was very good. But to some extent, the party is over. And you may remember this cartoon from The Economist of 3 years ago already, which was showing this old man, which was, closing the party. And in fact, this old man of this Economist cartoon is those two infernal couple that you have in the EU and in the US. In the EU, you have Margaret Vestager in charge of competition policy and Thierry Breton in charge of digital policies. And then in the US, you have two vocal critique of the big tech, which have been appointed by Biden at key position. Lina Khan, she's now the chair of the FTC, and Tim Wu, who is the White House digital advisor. So clearly with those four people, things are about to change in some region of the world. Now, we are not starting from nothing. And in a way, I think the first couple here, the European couple, started before the US couple, because the EU has opened and closed and decided a number of cases, antitrust cases against Google. We had Google Shopping 4 years ago, which was about self-preferencing, Google preferencing shopping to other competitor to Google Shopping, Google Android, and Google AdSense. So 3 condemnation, nearly $10 billion of condemnation because of that, and a lot are in the making against Apple, against Amazon, against Facebook, and again against Google, for a number of behavior which relate to abusing their market power. And we have the same in the US. So in the US, none of the cases have yet been decided, but many are in the making against Facebook, in particular for the acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp some years ago, against Google, again in the ad tech environment, and then there is this famous Epic versus Apple cases. And we see also in China, that the Chinese government and administration is also trying to rein some of their big digital champion like Alibaba or Didi. So, you see that all over the world, you have a kind of antitrust push. Now, does that work? And in particular, all those 3 Google cases had their effect. And here I would say it's much ado about nothing, in the sense that, yes, those cases have been talked a lot, and still today we are discussing here in this conference. But on the other hand, I don't think it changed very much on the market. Google is still extremely powerful, and I'm not sure that the case have helped a lot. And I think now, so most of the legislators around the world are thinking at another strategy, understanding that maybe antitrust is not enough. And the other strategy that, again, you see across the world is to go through regulation. So, and the European Commission has proposed in December last year a very important piece of legislation, which is currently negotiated by the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers and could be adopted next year, to increase contestability and fairness in the digital environment. In the US, 5 bills have been proposed in June before the House and the Senate. And there is a series of bills, but they more or less aim at the same thing as what you have in the European proposal, which is more contestability through portability of data, interoperability of services, prohibition of discrimination, and also more control on merger and acquisition. In the UK, I mean, the UK government has just opened a consultation on what they call a pro-competitive regime for digital market consultation. We have the same in Australia, and again, all over the world, now there is this regulatory push. Now, what this regulatory push entails? First, it's really cover mostly the GAFAM and maybe their Chinese equivalent. So Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Alibaba's, and so on. And really what those new law are, or those proposed law are about, is for the big company which have very high turnover, very high market cap, and a lot of user, business user on the one hand, and end user on the other. So really the target is really the biggest companies of the world. And the second thing is what the law is about, and in a way, you know, it's a new set of commandments for the digital environment. First, there is a number of prohibitions. For instance, you cannot self-preference. So Google will not be able to privilege some of their company over Google search than others. You have to take care about conflict of interest. So Amazon cannot use the data they get through third-party seller for their own sales, because you know that Amazon is a bit the referee and the players. So they cannot use the data for both roles. So a number of prohibition, but also a number of access rules. And you all know how telecom has been regulated, and that is a bit inspired by the telecom regulation in the sense that we will force interoperability in some circumstances. So for instance, Facebook and other social network needs to be interoperable. We will force access to App Store, for instance. So if you are a small app developer, you should have able to have an access to an App Store at a price which is fair, and maybe access to data. If you want to launch a new search engine, you should get access to the different Google search data. So that's the second. The third is, and that's more in the US than in the EU, a stricter rule for M&A, and clearly a stricter control of the different acquisition that the big tech are doing for small tech. And maybe, but that's not the plan in Europe, but some are talking about that in the US, a structural separation. So to say, for instance, to Amazon, you cannot be at the same time a marketplace and sell yourself on the marketplace. You have to choose between those different roles. So to conclude, I think we can clearly say that the party of the big tech is over. They will not be left alone anymore, as they have been left alone over the last 20 years. And in a way, I would say that the legislators have learned from Zuckerberg, and they themselves now want to move fast and possibly break things. We also see with the European story that antitrust may help, but not a lot, so it's not very effective, and therefore antitrust has paved the way to regulation with mostly behavior intervention, but possibly also structural, and in some region of the world, a stricter merger control. Thank you very much.
We'll come back to you in a few minutes in the panel. I'm now delighted to introduce the next panelist, Michel Ledger, who is heading the media team at Canon International, and who will speak to us about the other concern around big tech, which is the challenge of finding this delicate balance between a value that all democracies cherish, which is the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, and on the other hand, a need to control illegal and harmful content and see their removal. Michel, over to you. And Michel is speaking from a beautiful holiday destination in the south of France. So thank you for interrupting your holiday and joining us, Michel.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Philippe, and thank you very much for the invitation. I don't know if you can actually see my slides already or not. Philippe?
Yes, not yet.
Okay, then I'm
Voila. Okay, it's perfect.
You can? Okay. So yes, so what I'm going to do is to just provide a very sort of high-level overview of the various regulatory approaches to tackle online harms. I'm going to focus mainly, obviously, on what's going on in the EU, because everybody's talking about it, the Digital Services Act, but I'll also, of course, allude to some of the other national initiatives. Now, one of the key questions to address is to either go to some sort of a problem-driven approach, i.e. whenever there's a problem, you act and you adopt specific legislation. And this, in fact, is what the European Commission, the previous European Commission, chose to do. So, and I'm sure it's probably the case as well in your regions of the world, you have a lot of sector-specific legislation that's been adopted over the years to tackle specific problems, like terrorist content, like copyright problems, like the protection of minors in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. So this is if you want, the problem-driven approach. But now everybody is talking more about a sort of holistic approach, and this is the approach of our new European Commission, headed by Ursula von der Leyen, and of course Commissioner Vestager and Breton that Alexandre referred to are actually implementing this more holistic approach. So in basically what we have got in Europe, and this is probably the way the wind's blowing in many regions of the world, is to have a mixed approach with you know, a sometimes complicated articulation between sector-specific rules and a more general piece of legislation. So there have been many initiatives in Europe already, and I think some of you may speak of these a little bit more in this panel. The Germans were the first ones to adopt a specific law, the Network Enforcement Act, in 2017, and then there was also initiatives in France. But that the law that was adopted, in fact, was struck down by the Constitutional Court because it wasn't respecting fundamental rights. So that's really a key issue. And then you've got in the UK, which is no longer a member state of the European Union, but an online safety bill, which is now, I think, nearly introduced in Parliament. So all these national initiatives are creating a sort of piecemeal situation, if you want, in Europe, and the European Commission, who's trying to, of course, harmonize all that, has voiced concerns. So that's the reason why it's decided to come up on the same day as it proposed the Digital Markets Act that Alexandre talked about. It decided to propose this Digital Services Act, which is just like the Digital Markets Act, a proposed regulation, which means that all the member states will be, in fact, regulated in the same manner by this piece of legislation. So you can imagine the huge difficulty of agreeing on the text, and it's now going through the process of adoption. And there are many amendments that have been proposed in the European Parliament. Many things will change, of course, in the text, but I'm going to bring to you, if you want, just a few of the high-level elements that we can find here, and then that may be used in other regions of the world. So, as Philippe said in his introductory comments, it's really a very delicate balancing act to be performed between, on the one hand, trying to ensure the safety of users when they're online, and secondly, freedom of expression. And that is what the European Commission sought to achieve in this proposal. But of course, as I've saying, this balance may be, go in one direction or in another, depending a little bit on the political forces that we see in the adoption process. Now, what's important to note at the moment is that this famous safe harbor principle is relatively untouched at the moment. So the idea that these big tech companies are not responsible for the content that's uploaded or posted on the networks remains at the moment in the current text. So that's important to mention, because it's something which is very fundamental for freedom of expression, of course. So the other big decisions to be taken when you're looking at all this is what services are you going to be covering. Now, Alexandre said, okay, the Digital Markets Act is there to regulate the big tech, the very large online platforms. Well, here what we're seeing with the Digital Services Act is that there are many other platforms. Of course, we're trying to the regulation will apply to the very large online platforms. Okay, that's of course, and they will have many obligations to comply with. But you should also not forget that the European Commission has also decided to regulate the more technical level of the internet, so internet access providers, for example, but also hosting service providers like Amazon Web Services. So those are the purely sort of private, if you want, hosting services. And then all the online platforms, all the marketplaces, the social media, the app stores, the collaborative economy, all that at the moment is in scope of this new piece of legislation. And there, it's interesting to see, that of course the focus is on the big tech, but you can't just regulate the big tech when you're talking about online harms, because harms can occur, at every level on every type of service. So what's equally as interesting, I find, is the services that are not in scope at the moment. And I hasten to add as well that we always regulate here in Europe services, okay, not companies, but the types of services that the companies provide. So the types of services that are not in scope are also incredibly interesting, because I've put on this part of the slide, for instance, Netflix type services, they are not in scope because there isn't a notion of intermediation. So Netflix decides precisely, which content is going to be made available on its website. There's editorial responsibility, if you want, of Netflix. A private messaging service like WhatsApp is out of scope as well. Google search at the moment is out of scope. Now, as I've said, all this is hugely debated, of course, and some of these services could, of course, come within the scope of the Digital Services Act. So that's the first thing to think about, if you want, is which services are we trying to regulate. The other key point, of course, is to recognise that these platforms are global. In some cases, of course, they don't necessarily have an establishment in all the countries. So you always have to think about, what you do with these non-established service providers. And here the situation in Europe is basically to say where they're going to be covered. So long as the services are offered to recipients that are established or that reside within the EU. Then of course you need to frame that a little bit. So we've got wording in the proposed DSA to say when there is this substantial connection with the EU, and then of course the consequence of all that is that these non-established service providers need to appoint a legal representative to be able to face orders and to comply with the legislation. So that's a huge issue as well to look at. The third point that I think is very interesting is what harms are we talking about? And here, there's a number of possible solutions as well. And I'm going to, of course, explain to you what the DSA is proposing to do, but we can also discuss in the panel, perhaps, other possibilities. So the harms in scope is basically is extremely wide in the proposed DSA. It's everything that's illegal or that's in breach of the platform's terms and conditions. So that's, if you want, they themselves decide what would have to be filtered out. So what's illegal is defined in a very wide way. It's what's illegal what's in breach of European legislation or of national legislation. So you really need to think extremely widely here. We're talking about, breaches of consumer protection legislation. We're talking about criminal offences. Everything is, if you want, is treated in the same manner. All that is considered to be illegal content. It's not only illegal content, but also illegal products. So of course, the fake Gucci handbag or the fake pharmaceutical product. illegal services or illegal activities. So it's incredibly wide. And now what's interesting is, there is also this notion of harmful content, something that's not necessarily illegal, but that can be harmful to certain categories of the population. I mean, a typical example as well is something like fake news, or something that would be harmful for children. And this if you want a second category of harmful content, only really needs to be addressed by the very large online platforms. And that's a solution proposed at the moment under the Digital Services Act. But really, there are other models that are possible as well. You can imagine that you would only address criminal offences, or you could also imagine that you would address harmful content like the protection of minors in these horizontal pieces of legislation. Now, what we see, and here, don't fly off your chairs, but this is a whopping slide, basically to explain that the proposed Digital Services Act proposes to introduce asymmetric rules depending on the type of intermediaries that we're talking about. So the mere technical intermediaries, the hosting service providers, the online platforms, and the very large online platforms. So those that have got more than 45 million active monthly users. Okay, and so if you look at the very large online platforms, basically they need to respect all the rules that apply to all the intermediaries, whereas the mere technical level only needs to comply with certain of the rules. Now, if I was to summarize these rules, it's very difficult because there are a lot of them, but they're mainly procedural rules. Okay, so they're mainly to do with transparency of obligations that are placed on platforms, and rules to safeguard users or uploaders. And I've highlighted here in red some of the very interesting elements that we have in the Digital Services Act. For instance, the regulation of recommender systems, so ranking systems, why we're seeing certain things. The regulation of online ads, online advertising, and including online targeted advertising. But here, as I said at the moment, it's really more to do with transparency obligation. Okay, inform the user why they are seeing something. And then there's a lot about content moderation, of course. The fact that there are systems to harmonize rules on how to report illegal information, obligations on platforms to report serious crimes to public authorities, rules on the suspension of users, rules on trusted flaggers. There's all sorts of things basically, but remember that it's mainly procedural rules to do with transparency about what's going on. Okay, that's what I mean. At the moment, there are no deadlines. There's nothing to do with you need to take down this type of information within X number of hours. That's not in it at the moment, but it could change because this is very tense, of course, in the European Parliament at the moment, and at national level as well. So the last bit I wanted to talk about is to do with the oversight. Of course, all this begs a very, very deep overhaul of the way platforms are overseen by regulatory authorities. And here we're witnessing, I think, a very major shift that some of us have been waiting for years. But it's a very, very difficult question, of course. Because to date, at the moment, in the European Union, and I'm sure it's probably the case in many other regions of the world, this whole area is largely non-supervised or supervised by sector-specific regulators, and there's no real mechanism for cooperation or information sharing between regulators. So what the DSA, proposed Digital Services Act, tries to do is to introduce a very robust supervisory system, which will be in the hands of the national of the individual member states, if you want. And there's this new notion of a digital service coordinator. I'm not going to get into that because that's too linked to EU legislation. But basically, remember that contrary to the Digital Markets Act, it's not the European Commission that's in the main driving seat, it's the national regulatory authorities. And they will be given very wide-ranging enforcement and supervision powers, and they would have to coordinate very much with one another. Now, this is something that's close to the heart of Alexandre and I. It's to do with the fact that we think that we should be going towards a new ecosystem of oversight, where the regulator would not necessarily be alone, but he would multiple actors would be involved somehow in the oversight. The platforms themselves would have a number of things to do, and that's already included in the proposed DSA. They would have to appoint compliance officers, that sort of idea. Users could be involved, researchers as well, because they in the proposed DSA they should have access to a lot of data. There's this idea of independent auditors who should verify what the platforms are doing, and of course all this is an area where there should be heavy reliance on technology and on data scientists to oversee the application of the rules by platforms. So in a nutshell, Philippe, that's what I wanted to bring to you, just to say at the end that of course the European Commission does have backstop powers and can take actual action against the platforms, the very large online platforms, when when they don't comply with the national authorities' enforcement actions, and they can the European Commission can issue enormous fines going up to 6% of the global annual turnover of these companies, and has many powers to request information, to carry out on-site inspections, etc. So enforcement is really sort of around 1/4 of the whole Digital Services Act. So it just shows you the importance of enforcement. So I finished now, Philippe. I hope I didn't take up too much time. And if you have any questions, of course, we'll take them during the panel or another time.
Thank you, Michel. 17 minutes instead of 7, but that's fine. Let's now move to our next speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anthony Clayton from the Institute for Sustainable Development at the University of West Indies. Tony, the floor is yours.
Philippe. Merci bien. And hello, everybody. We've been asked to talk about successful strategies for regulating big tech in the Caribbean, which is quite challenging because we don't have any. But maybe by the end of this session, we will be able to come up with some successful strategies. Let me talk a little bit about some of the issues. I'm sure you've seen this exhortation from Facebook that we should all get involved in a Facebook group. There are over 1.8 billion Facebook groups to choose from. Unfortunately, some of them are criminal enterprises. Cybercrime is now estimated at $6 trillion a year. Within that, platform crime is estimated at $1.5 trillion a year. This is where technology platforms and social media are used for trafficking narcotics, counterfeit goods, money laundering, and tax evasion. This is one example. This is from 1 year ago, when a BBC investigation found that one Facebook group was being set up to exchange, to loot and trade stolen artifacts. Facebook responded. They said they'd taken down 49 of these groups. This was not very impressive because the investigation found over 120 Facebook groups in the Middle East and North Africa alone developed solely for looting and trafficking. The largest of these groups had over 437,000 members, which means that Facebook groups are now among the largest criminal organizations in the world. It's very important to understand that this is not a case of gangs migrating online. This is actually a change in the organization of transnational organized crime. Traditional gangs were typically hierarchical. They knew each other. They came from quite often the same part of the world. These emerging criminal structures that we're now seeing are purely virtual. They know each other, they've never met, they don't know each other's real names. They know each other only by handles. Their transactions are in cryptocurrency. These criminal organizations assemble very quickly and they regenerate very quickly. This is a new and very challenging form of criminal organization. And a large part of this is courtesy of Facebook. We're seeing a similar phenomenon with the way that terrorist networks are adapting to the modern media age. Terrorists are becoming increasingly adept at using social media to control the narrative, to broadcast propaganda and atrocities, and to recruit. By 2015, Islamic State were making up to 200,000 posts a day. And many of these were aimed at a very particular demographic, disaffected youth with prior criminal records. Back before 2009, this is when Al-Qaeda was the dominant terrorist franchise. About 25% of the known terrorists or potential terrorists in Europe had prior criminal convictions. By 2015, this was now the Islamic State era, this was up to about 50%, which indicates the effectiveness of this marketing strategy, this social media-based marketing strategy by Islamic State. Islamic State were the first terrorist organization to make effective use of social media, but they will not be the last. They were also very effectively using the internet to disseminate information. The EU reported 54,000 websites with information on how to construct improvised explosive devices posted online in less than 1 year, and 2/3 of this information was shared within 2 hours of posting. This is a very effective way to spread not only your message, but the means of striking against other countries. This was something of a turning point. This was the Christchurch massacre in March of 2019. This was entirely a social media created phenomenon. This man, Brenton Tarrant, he killed 51 people, he injured 49, he live streamed the massacre. And this is the point, that social media doesn't just provide a platform to terrorism, it's also now a motivating factor. It allows it to propagate, it gives it global reach. The whole point of terrorism is to create fear, to create alarm and despondency in the hearts of the people that you want to strike against. And social media has given terrorist networks perhaps the most powerful weapon that they've ever had. As a result, in the UK, the National Coordinator for the Counter-Extremism Programme said that the country now has a far greater threat from terrorists who self-radicalize online, that they are now a greater threat than those mobilized by terrorist organizations abroad. And he talked about an explosion of material inciting violence targeted very specifically at young and vulnerable people and those with mental health issues. These are prime recruits. And of course, we've also seen the way that social media has become a front in conflict, in great power rivalry, in the war between states. We've seen in particular Russia, China, and North Korea making increasingly effective, targeted use of messaging to encourage division, ethnic tension, conspiracy theories, and undermine democracy. We have evidence of political manipulation via social media, attempts to influence political outcomes, elections, and so forth in over 30 countries. And we have, now of course, we have the private sector involved in this activity. We have one firm, Cambridge Analytica, which has been traced in at least 7 countries in the Caribbean in attempts to influence political outcomes and determine election results. And we also have social media being used as by vigilantes to focus and target violence on other ethnic groups. So we've seen riots, lynching, people being burned alive, and other attacks in India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Mexico, and other countries linked specifically to hate speech on social media. We've had complaints from Sri Lanka, for example, that Facebook don't even have an office in that country. They have been absolutely unresponsive to requests to block this material. The problem is, this is a really fundamental regulatory failure. Section 230 of the US Communications Decency Act defines the platforms as intermediaries. They cannot legally be held liable as publishers of content posted by a third party. This is overdue for review. Section 230 and the other legislative gaps and regulatory weaknesses are now key enablers of criminal and terrorist activities. There have been some attempts to start to address this. The UK Ofcom will be given powers to oblige firms that host malign content to either prevent it or rapidly take it down, and to start enforcing their own rules with regard to social content. The enforcement by the companies themselves has been, in some cases, fairly derisory. In Germany, large social media have got 24 hours to take down illegal content, fines up to 50 million euros, which for a large company is absolutely trivial. They probably spend more than that on coffee. And Australia's sharing of Abhorrent Violent Material Act, possible jail sentences of up to 3 years for executives, and financial penalties of up to 10% of global turnover. This is obviously a much more serious deterrent. And this is the sort of thing that we will, I think, have to look at unless we see more responsiveness from the social media companies. Ladies and gentlemen, just 2 questions. Will these measures be adequate? And finally, what are we going to do in the Caribbean? We are a group of small nations and we have very little leverage over these companies. So the question is, how can we address that gap and how can we do something about this? The Caribbean and Central America is the most violent part of the world. We have the highest homicide rate of anywhere, 45, 50 times higher than in relatively safe parts of the world like Europe. The last thing that we need is the further penetration of social media by criminal and terrorist networks targeted at our disaffected youth. The consequences for us would be absolutely catastrophic. We need to do something about this before we get to that point. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony, for highlighting the link between hate speech online and physical violence in the real world. Thank you for that. And when it comes to suggestion on what can be done in the Caribbean, I'm delighted to welcome now our next speaker, David Gary from Digicel, with an attempt to suggest the path forward for legislators, regulators in the region. David, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and hello. I hope you can hear me all right.
Yes, perfectly.
Great. And can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Great. Well, online harms and harmful market practices we've spoken about, and we all know we have a problem, and there are examples of solutions from other jurisdictions that this region can look to. The development of a single Caribbean ICT space now really is very pressing. We have different rules and different regulations in each country. We have countries of very small scale. We have low populations in many of the countries and small regulatory bodies that obviously have very limited resources. At the same time, we've also seen the rapid acceleration of the digital economy, in particular since the start of COVID-19 pandemic, and the digital economy is becoming the economy. So, you know, with this, the fragmented approach to regulation which has worked well enough in the era of local telephone companies providing local services in each country, really it's totally inadequate for the global digital economy that we have today. And if we don't change our approach in this region very quickly now, we will find that every service imaginable, from food and grocery delivery to medical consultations, to media, to communications, to transport and tourism, all of these will be provided by large global digital companies. And frankly, there'll be no companies left locally to regulate if things go that way. So we do urgently need a harmonized approach across the Caribbean. And at the Caribbean level, we need to agree a set of principles, that apply in every country. And local laws then, in our view, need to be amended to give effect to these principles in every jurisdiction. So what can the Caribbean do? Well, having studied this for some years, we believe there's 5 key provisions that could be introduced into local law that would really, really assist. And the first thing is, you know, by amending our local telecoms laws to include some provisions, we can empower ourselves in this region. And the first step would be to you require the local registration of digital platforms above a certain threshold. And this has been done in South Korea and other places. In South Korea, in late last year, they introduced such an obligation. They defined the level of the threshold for the platforms that have to register, and there's a list of them now, and they include large platforms like Google and Facebook and others. And the obligations that stem from this include appointing a local representative to deal with consumer complaints and also to deal with the regulator and respond to regulatory inquiries. So the second step then, or second provision, would be to ensure that certain provisions of the local ICT law are mandatory for digital platforms. So a duty to cooperate with legal authorities like the police and the regulator, and an ongoing duty to file regular accounts with the regulator and details of traffic usage, perhaps annually or indeed more frequently if the regulator requires. And again, this has been done in South Korea. The third piece then that would be important and could be included in local ICT law would be to include provision to help tackle the plague of false information and defamatory information on the internet by making it easier to request the identity of the posters of this type of information from the platforms themselves. The issue is it's very difficult at present to get this information because you need to go to the court to get a court order, and this can be very costly and time consuming because courts generally apply injunction criteria. And then once you have the order, you have to serve it on the platform overseas. Other jurisdictions have looked at this and how you can include a very straight provision that allows for a very straightforward application to be made to the courts locally and a duty on platforms to comply with such a court order, which would remove the obligation to be dealing with overseas platforms because you'd be dealing with the local representative, obviously there. The next provision then, and as we've discussed earlier, competition law has emerged as a key tool in tackling market abuses. Now, I think we all will accept in the Caribbean that it's pretty unlikely a Caribbean regulator is going to ask Facebook or Google to break apart, but there's other very important things that regulators can do, and we're all familiar with the concept of market reviews. And these allow regulators to investigate markets and to impose remedies. Now, the Caribbean needs to equip itself with a modern antitrust framework. And without this, the possibility of even taking action is excluded. And unfortunately, that's where we find ourselves today. Not every country in the region has a modern competition law. Jamaica and Barbados are probably the best examples in the region. Trinidad and Tobago has an Unfair Competition Act as well. Many other countries' competition provisions are specific to licensees as they're set out in telecoms licenses. So, although the best solution would be for every country to adopt a modern competition act, this may take a long time in the region, and it might be much more practical to include provisions that reflect prohibitions on anti-competitive behaviour that are found in modern antitrust frameworks, include these in our local telecoms or ICT laws. And the key here is that the ICT law should provide that these competition law provisions apply to any providers of digital services, regardless of their location. So it's not about the identity of local license entities, it's about the providers of services wherever they're located. Regulators could then be empowered to declare digital platforms to be dominant suppliers, from which certain regulatory obligations could follow. And the wording of the competition provision should also permit affected persons to bring private actions based on those provisions before the courts. So not just leave it to the regulators. Now, resources is, of course, a problem for regulators in our region. And the legislation really should provide a role for the CARICOM Competition Commission, where resources can be focused to assist local regulators. And we could turn our mind to Article 174 of the Treaty of Chaguaramas, and that requires member states, in fact, to enact legislation to ensure determinations of commission are enforceable in their jurisdictions. And then, as examples of the type of market reviews the competition law provisions enable, The Australian ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry found that Google had substantive market power in search and search advertising, and Facebook had substantive market power in the supply of social media services and display advertising services, and both had substantial bargaining power in their dealings with news media businesses in Australia. And Australia also provided the example of a remedy. It mandated a duty to deal where digital companies and local publishers and broadcasters were required to negotiate commercial agreements, in that case for the use of locally produced content, with the possibility of an arbitrator deciding terms if the parties could not agree. And in fact, agreements were reached quickly once the scheme was announced. And a similar duty to deal was mandated in South Korea recently, where a court ruled that Netflix cannot refuse to pay invoices for network usage, because this is something that digital platforms are able to do, is just refuse to engage. And obviously, local operators have an obligation to carry content. So they're abusing this. So this is somewhere where the regulator can step in to tip the balance in favor of fairness again. So what we need is a framework that obliges platforms to engage with local regulators and providers of services. And then finally, I'll turn to the question of online harms. So, I suppose firstly, we'd say big tech knew full well the damage that was being caused, and even some deliberately designed their systems to promote divisive and harmful content as this increased engagement in order to boost the profits. And you can read books on this. I mean, the Roger McNamee was one of the early investors in Facebook, and he wrote a book about this and the direct experience he had of that going on. But there's two possible approaches the Caribbean could take. Firstly, one could focus on individual pieces of content, so obligations to take down or disable access to individual pieces of content, and this would be known as the ex post approach, or to focus on systems and processes. Platforms would then under that be obliged to assess the risk of certain types of harmful content being present on their platforms and take appropriate steps to mitigate those risks. In other words, the ex ante approach. The former approach has the advantage of imposing simpler obligation, perhaps, and compliance is easier to determine, and maybe the better option for the Caribbean region. And on this, we would say that there needs to be, firstly, a clear requirement that illegal content must be removed within a given time frame. So we're talking about illegal hate speech or terrorist content, or content that relates to activities that are illegal, such as images of child abuse and so on. As regards content that's deemed harmful, a schedule could perhaps be agreed regionally and published by ministers or regulators, perhaps in regulations. And again, this would need to be removed within a given time frame by platforms. Now, as I said, the ex-ante approach is probably very difficult for the Caribbean to enforce, but maybe there's a way also of looking to outputs from the UK and other regions such that are looking at this ex-ante approach and to require the same standard that be applied in the Caribbean region. So the Caribbean isn't getting a sort of a second-rate service or different service from what's happening in the UK or the US or other jurisdictions. Then next, we would say that there should be an obligation to report any illegal content to the regulator when it is discovered. Then fourth, a transparency reporting obligation. So how do platforms deal with complaints, illegal and harmful content? Provide an annual report to the regulator on this. Next then, as we said earlier, have a designated authorized person, so a local representative to receive service of regulatory and civil proceedings, regulatory investigations, regulatory questions. And this is important because obviously many digital platforms do not have a physical presence in the Caribbean. Next then, a credible proportionate sanctions should be in the ICT law. So uniform penalties for non-compliance. For example, fines of up to 10% of regional turnover, plus daily fines for non-compliance. perhaps even with the possibility of regional blocking order in the case of non-compliance. Again, the regulator will be in charge of enforcing this. And then finally, mandate that services to consumers are subject to local law and the local courts, so the local jurisdiction is not avoided by platforms. So we believe that these 5 principles should be incorporated into the ICT laws of all the countries, and we have a great opportunity in the region as there's a lot of work on the single ICT space ongoing, and discussions will be happening over the next couple of months. And we believe it's possible to agree a set of principles that all countries in the region should sign up to, and then following that, commit to making the necessary amendments to the local telecoms and ICT laws, within a given time frame. And as I mentioned, this is very pressing now, given the speed at which the digital economy is developing. So taking action really in the short term, I think, is going to be important. Thank you for your time. I'll hand back to you, Philippe.
Thank you very much, David. We will now move to the full panel. I'm asking the organizers to bring in the other panelists for the few minutes we've got left. And thank you in particular to the 2 professors for sticking to their speaking time. Is Tony still with us, or is he? Yes. I would like, and I was saying, Tony, thank you to the 2 professors who kept their speaking time. I would like to ask Alexandre and Tony to try to make the bridge between the 2 topics that we discussed, which is on the one hand, competition law and what comes out of competition law in terms of measures to promote competition, and on the other hand, the finding of this difficult, this question of the removal of illegal and some harmful content. And the question I would like to ask to you, Tony and Alex, is: do you believe that if regulators succeed in the coming years in creating more competition in some of the online platform business, that will have a positive knock-on effect on the removal, the removal by the platform themselves of more harmful content? Alex, do you want to start? I know we have discussed it at length with Tony. I know his position. Alex, we've never discussed it. What do you think? Do you have a strong view on that?
So, no, I don't have a strong view. I tend to think that competition in general is good. And so by having more competition, you may incentivize the company to behave more in the interest of the user. But it's true that in this specific case, sometimes having more harmful content may attract more users. And so in that specific case, the market is probably not the best regulator. And this is why you need an authority. I also just want to say that we discussed 2 different things, online harm and economic harm, but we are talking about the same company, the same algorithm, the same data. So clearly there are synergies in enforcing both types of law.
Thank you very much. Tony?
Yes, well, I agree with Alex. I think that competition is good. And I think in particular, it's important to prevent the kind of monopolistic practices that we've increasingly seen from corporations like Facebook, which have a very bad habit of buying up companies that they think might become potential rivals. I think there is a strong case for using antitrust legislation to break up companies that behave in this way. But I also agree that this will not, even if we have more competition, that this will not necessarily solve the problem. In a marketplace, there is a market for shocking and divisive information, which Facebook have exploited very successfully. And as you can see at the moment, corporations which actually started off as center-right, like Fox News, are becoming increasingly extremist because they are catering to a particular segment of the community. Even if there's competition, there will be people who make a good profit from catering to some of the worst elements in all of us, the worst side of humanity. So I think it's very important that there still have to recognize that this is not a problem that can be solved purely by the market or by competition alone.
Okay.
there's a very clear case for regulation to ensure that certain abuses are prevented.
Thank you, Tony. I would like to go to Michel for a quick answer on the following question. If the CEOs of social networks, of all social networks, were absolutely committed to do the right thing, to stop exploiting extremist content and to increase engagement and really wanted to eradicate illegal and harmful content from their network, Michel, do they find in the various countries where they operate, at least the one that you know, do they find clear guidance, clear from the authorities as to what is legal, not legal, what is harmful, not harmful? So,
yeah, no, I think it's a very difficult thing for them to do, actually, because I think the definition at the moment of illegality is very much dependent on the individual countries. So, it is difficult. I mean, I would feel, I think, happier if a legislator would say, okay, we're talking about criminal offences, and there you have a clear list of the sort of things that would be need to be eradicated if that was to be possible. In terms of illegal content, harmful content rather, that's in the much more, we're in muddy waters there. I mean, it really is a matter of appreciation, and there's always going to be a level of appreciation, and there it's probably, in my view, because of freedom of expression concerns, it's much more difficult to regulate precisely. And that's why I believe that what the DSA is doing, in a way, I mean, I think we could go further in relation to harmful content, but yeah, having flexibility there, I think, is important, and you've got to think as well about the totalitarian countries, and what they do as well. So it's not easy.
Thank you. David and Tony, the region much better than the Europeans on this panel. What would you say about the legal guidance that is given to platform in the region as to what is illegal is probably clearer, but what is harmful? Do they get clear guidance from authorities on this?
Well, as you call the names first, I'll go in the order you call them, but at present they don't. But I think it's important to remember that we're regulating for this region. We're not trying to solve the problems of the world here. We just need to regulate for the Caribbean. So guidance, and this is why I mentioned that a schedule of what's considered harmful content could be agreed in the region, and this would give guidance. And let's not forget that the big tech platforms, in the beginning told us there should be no regulation of the internet because, this would ruin the whole thing. And then they said they should set the standards because otherwise you can't trust what would go on in China and so on. And then they changed the story when advertisers said we don't want to be associated with harmful content. These are huge companies with giant resources. They can absolutely comply with laws and regulations as long as they exist. Everybody else has to have a compliance department and see what the laws of the jurisdictions which provide services say, to comply with them. They're well able to do it. So really, it's a matter for this region to set out the framework and the requirements of these companies, and it's for them to comply with the rules.
And Tony, you will have the final word because our time is up. But a final word on what are the steps that media regulators like the one you are chairing, what should be their priorities in terms of perhaps bringing more clarity as to what is deemed harmful, as David said, for the Caribbean region, not for the world?
Well, I agree very much with the roadmap that David outlined. I think that is the way to go. My concern is that I'm not convinced that some of those steps are easy or even feasible. There are several problems that I can see. One of them is that governments in the region actually tend to be very sensitive to the charge of interfering in any way with free expression on social media. Now, this is a state of affairs that's to some extent rooted in our history, but also unfortunately plays into the hands of the social media platforms. There's also a real challenge in trying to get any effective action coordinated across the region. These are going to be major challenges, but in general, I also, perhaps final note, I do think that if possible, an ex-ante approach is better, because you're talking about very slender capacity. We try to work on at the moment we work on an ex-post basis, but the volume of material is simply overwhelming. So we have to move to an ex-ante approach. We have to actually impose obligations on the platforms to behave in a responsible manner, which at the moment they violate frequently.
Thank you, Tony. That will be the final word. If you allow me, I would like to add just one point to say that stating principle in the law is one thing, then there is a challenge of ensuring compliance. And I'm not here the voice of platforms, of big tech, but having a certain degree of harmonization in the region would facilitate compliance. It's not easy to comply when you operate in many countries, even if you are big, and having common rules, not for the whole world, but at least per region, increases vastly the chances that you meet the legal standards. I'm sure we could debate that for another hour, but we don't have time. I would like now to thank you all for joining us this morning and hope to see you at another CANTO event. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Je vous en prie. Merci bien.
Merci.